So I wanted to compare and contrast the president and the governor in the lawmaking process and do so by utilizing some materials that Professor Tom Nussbaum at McGeorge and I put together when we both used to teach the Introduction to Capital Lawyering class at McGeorge Law School. So for those who are involved in the legislative process, you can appreciate some of the points that distinguish the roles of the chief executive at the federal and state levels and the governor and president's roles in enacting legislation at these levels of government. Fundamentally, both the US president and the California governor draw their authority from naturally the federal and state constitutions, respectively. Those outline their respective roles in the lawmaking process. In addition, federal and state statutes provide additional duties and responsibilities for the chief executive in the adoption of laws, and their individual roles are similar regarding both the legislative and budget processes, even if some of the specifics differ. So let's try and appreciate some of those similarities and difference to better understand the role of the chief executive at the federal and state levels. The executive branches of the state and federal governments play similar roles, but they also have different aspects. Obviously, the governor and the executive branch of state government are based upon their federal counterparts. And in broad terms, both federal and state chief executives are involved in the lawmaking process in that they can and do propose and ultimately sign budgets. They sign or veto legislation. They make appointments of executive branch employees who obviously interpret, administer the laws, and draft regulations and adopt those regulations. Both the president and the governor make major policy addresses to their respective legislative counterparts. The governor makes the State of the State speech in January, and the president as well that month makes the State of the Union speech. And these are an opportunity for the chief executive to establish their priorities with the legislative branches of government. The president and the governor often outline major policy initiatives, their budget priorities, and generally in an effort to advocate legislators in understanding the goals and objectives that the chief executive has. One difference is that the governor can call the, actually both, excuse me, both the governor and the president can call the legislative branch into extraordinary session. The governor of the state of California does this more often, such as to address natural disasters, a budget crisis, or perhaps some other high profile policy issue. The president and the governor both propose their respective budgets for the federal government and for the state government so that those branches of government can operate. Those proposed budgets are naturally reviewed and modified by the legislative branch. The governor, through the Department of Finance or DOF, actively participates in the legislative process and the legislature's review and ultimate adoption of the state budget. They provide details and analyses of the governor's budget priorities and advocate for them. And similarly, the president, through the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, also educates and attempts to persuade the Congress to adopt the president's budget proposals and to work interactively with both houses of Congress to advance the president's spending priorities. California law gives the governor significant authority to reduce or control expenditures, especially when they come to the executive branch of government. Our state constitution provides the governor with line item veto authority, which means the governor can reduce or eliminate any of the thousands of individual appropriations made in the annual state budget. And this authority, this line item or blue pencil authority, makes the governor very powerful in budget negotiations. So the governor, in many ways, can have final say over budget expenditures in this state. although technically the legislature by 2/3 vote of both houses can override a line item veto or reduction just like a bill. Other provisions of the law give the governor authority to reduce or expend or to control expenditures during the budget year, especially with respect to agencies under the governor's direct control. Budget control language, line item, veto authority, and these types of things give the governor the ability to encourage or discourage policymaking, maybe with regard to particular agencies or how the legislature exercises its authority over those departments and agencies. Similarly, the president is required to annually prepare and submit a comprehensive federal budget to Congress. Their fiscal year begins on October 1, whereas the California fiscal year begins July 1. And the president, like the governor, sets out his or her priorities and proposes policy initiatives in the federal budget, generally soon after the Congress convenes in January each year. Now, unlike the governor of California, the United States president does not have line item veto authority. So the president cannot reduce or eliminate any items of appropriation in the federal budget. This fact creates more of, in some people's view, a level playing field between the executive and legislative branches of the federal government when we deal with the adoption of the final annual federal budget. The OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, is the implementation and enforcement arm of presidential policy at the federal level. They, of course, do budget development and execution. They also coordinate and review all significant federal regulations that are promulgated by executive agencies. They provide legislative clearance and coordination, such as review and clearance of all agency communications with Congress, such as testimony and the drafting of bills, to ensure they're consistent with agency legislative views, and of course, proposals are reflecting presidential policy perspectives. The governor's DOF does not have quite that level of power and broad view vested with the OMB. And as part of the lawmaking process, naturally, both the US president and the California governor meet with legislative leaders, especially those who are of the governor's or president's same political party, in an effort to lobby and cajole them or perhaps reach compromise on thorny issues in major legislation. Obviously, also to pitch executive branch priorities that might need legislation or budget funding. The chief executives at the federal and state levels also meet and communicate with individual legislators in attempts to, secure their votes or reach some sort of compromise on pending legislation. And of course, the president and governor bring legislative leaders together, sometimes with major stakeholders, for example, to discuss and often fashion legislation. And then for priority issues, I think both the president and the governor propose specific legislation, that a member then of the legislative body, the Congress or the legislature, carries on behalf of the chief executive. In California, the governor may even propose specific legislation to take to the voters via the initiative route, or it can be accomplished through a proposed constitutional amendment, which requires a 2/3 vote of both houses of the California legislature. Or they can pursue the initiative route, which requires collecting the requisite number of signatures to place that measure on the statewide ballot. This avenue of a ballot measure, a form of direct democracy, is not available at the federal level. So the US president does not have this ability. In other words, the president can only work directly with Congress on legislation rather than bypass them through a initiative measure, for example, taking a measure directly to the people for a vote. That is available in California, but it's not an option at the federal level. Nonetheless, I think similar to the California governor at the state level, the US president, while they don't have direct power to enact federal statutes on their own, obviously they have a great ability to influence legislation through the legislative process. The president has the power to recommend legislation. In Article 2, Section 3, it says that such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. And of course, he can give to the Congress information of the state of the union. That is also found in Article 2, Section 3 of the US Constitution. So the president, through a member of Congress, can introduce legislation. And in fact, the federal administration frequently drafts the text of legislative proposals and then asks members or leaders of the president's party to introduce those bills and carry them. In terms of final action on legislation, the president does have a pocket veto if a measure is not acted upon during a specified period of time. On the other hand, a pocket signature exists at the state level. That is, a bill becomes a state statute if the governor doesn't act upon that bill within the required period of time. And of course, at both the federal and state levels, the president and California governor have a specified period of time in which they have to either sign or veto legislation that's sent to their desk. As you can see, I think, or hear, that chief executives of the state and federal governments obviously play a very crucial role in the lawmaking process at the federal and state levels of government. They are, of course, one of the three co-equal branches of government. And again, the president and governor have generally final say, except for a veto override of a gubernatorial or presidential veto. But because of that rule, the chief executive, the president, and the governor can often dictate the ultimate outcome of legislation or fashion bills in a form that is acceptable to the governor or the president at the federal or state levels.